How do you heal emotional wounds? How can you process individual and ancestral trauma so that you maintain your capacity for joy? That's what this episode is about. You're listening to Pure Light, where we explore how you can believe in yourself and be happy with who you are. My name is Eiley. This is episode 142, and I'm so excited to be here with Demetria Jackson. Demetria is a spiritual mentor and wellness practitioner for socially conscious women, practicing liberation at the intersection of spirituality and social justice. She also does work related to equity, diversity, and inclusion for yoga teachers and studio owners, which I have personally experienced. We met in Kundalini yoga teacher training several years ago, and so I'm so delighted to have her here with me. Welcome, Demetria.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I know, this is something that is so close to your heart, this healing of individual and ancestral trauma. So I wanted to start with, how would you define that? Like, how would you describe that?
Yeah. So, trauma to me is a wound. It's a complex wound. It's also a universal wound. Universal meaning we all have experienced some sort of trauma. And even if we don't identify personally with that, some sort of trauma has been passed down to us. So it's something that affects all of us. So it's a complex wound that usually occurs when our physical, our emotional, or our psychological safety has been threatened. And so, car accidents can be traumatic, abuse can be traumatic, death can be traumatic, being cheated on can be traumatic. Having your parents laugh at you or minimize your experiences can be traumatic, especially like in a moment of vulnerability. Racism can be traumatic. Other forms of oppression can be traumatic. So trauma is complex, and it can happen at any point in time in our lives. It can be passed down to us, and it often occurs when we experience a loss of safety, or our safety has been threatened in some way.
Right. Yeah. So it's something that can happen almost at any point then, given not only the circumstances and like what's happening around us, but also how we're interpreting it, like emotionally and mentally.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what was the catalyst for your own journey in terms of healing and dealing with your own trauma?
Mm-hmm. So I feel like I've always just been on a journey of healing in some way or shape or form. But what started to become intentional about the work that I was doing, probably when I was about 20. I was going through a period where, I was in university, and I was a part of different activist organizations, and, things were happening, and I was going through an experience of a loss of identity, I would say. It was like I no longer knew who I was. I was very insecure. And a lot of things that I had suppressed in my childhood started to come up. And one of those things was the fact that I really hadn't processed the death of my father. And so my father passed away when I was 10 years old. He had cancer. And, people often think that when you lose a loved one to a chronic illness like that, you have some time to, gather yourself, to process, to say your goodbyes, to get things in order. But as a 10-year-old, in my experience, no one had actually expressed to me the difference between getting sick with a cold and flu and getting sick with a chronic illness like cancer. And so my entire childhood, I would watch my father go in and out of hospitals and have surgeries. He had a brain tumor that was inoperable, but every time they would go in and cut away a little bit. And, so I watched him come in and out of surgeries 3 or 4 times, I think. And, one time he just went into the hospital and never came out. And in that last stint in the hospital, I watched him, really like deteriorate. in a big way. I watched him lose his memory and, forget who I was and lose his ability to feed himself and to get out of bed and all of that. So I watched his body, his physical body, literally deteriorate. I watched him lose his mind. And no one thought to have a conversation with me about what that was. And,
we just ran into some technical difficulties, but we are back now. So Demetria, the last thing that I heard was watching your father deteriorate when you were 10, which I would imagine would be so hard, and how no one thought to have a conversation with you about how what he was going through was different than other kinds of not being well.
Okay. Yeah. So no one thought to have a conversation with me. And my mom, she did the best that she could. She was processing her own trauma. She was going through her own thing. And she thought that by not telling me, she was keeping me safe. And that's understandable. But, processing it years later, it's actually a thing that has really affected me in a big way, because now, it was like I lost my, it's like I lost my father, in a car accident, like instantaneously, when it wasn't. And so I didn't really have time to process. And so that was a shock to my system. And, I learned my body reacted in a way where 3 days later, I had learned to shut down my emotions because I was feeling entirely too much. And that carried with me throughout my life. I started to realize that I wasn't actually, every time I would experience any kind of stress, I wouldn't actually process those emotions. I would just put them away in a deep, dark space, and when I was about 20, I had an experience where everything that I had buried started coming up for me. And that wasn't a fun experience, as you can imagine, because then I'm trying to deal with schoolwork and I'm navigating social life and I'm living in a town that's, the town that I went to school in, which isn't my hometown. And I'm away from home and I'm doing all these things and I'm trying to process this grief that I should have processed years ago. And so that was really the start of something really beautiful in my life, of wanting to heal in a big way, of needing to heal. Actually, it didn't come out of a period of wanting. It came out of a period of needing, because I physically could not function. I was struggling with depression. I was struggling with anxiety. I was projecting everything on other people. It was just a really dark time in my life, and that lasted for several years. And so that was really the start of my healing journey. And then, just a few years ago, I became a mom and I had a baby. And through that process, other things started coming up for me. But I think most importantly, I became hyper aware of the fact that if I didn't deal with the things that were coming up for me, the traumas that I had experienced in my childhood, just, beyond my father passing, that I was inevitably going to pass that on to him, my child. And so I started to go again deeper on this journey of looking not only at my own traumas, but the traumas that have been passed down to me, that I've taken on, that are not mine to begin with, that do not belong to me. And so it's been a really beautiful time, these last 4 years, of exploring, the family secrets and the things that we don't talk about. And the reasons why Auntie so-and-so doesn't talk to Uncle, this and that, or why, we do this things that we do. It's been a really beautiful healing experience of looking at the immediate kind of family secrets, but also, and family traumas, and also looking at the longer, more societal ramifications of oppression and colonization, and how that has impacted my family lineage as well. So a lot of healing, a lot of awareness building, a lot of exploration has been happening. And it's all been, triggered by just an emotional time in my life, and also, birthing a human.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's unpack it a little bit because it sounds like the journey was like the catalyst for it was really, it's something that happened in layers. There was that event when you were around 20 that kind of started the initial thing and that led to a certain level of healing. And then the next catalyst was having a kid. And that just kind of took it to another level.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So like what the loss of identity thing, like I'm curious to know a bit more about how that played into that need for healing. Because you said it wasn't a want, it was a need. It was something that was like, this needs to happen now.
Mm-hmm.
And so what was it about, like, I guess the combination of everything that was going on at that point that led to it being something that you could no longer ignore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, for me, I've always felt a little bit out of place throughout my life. It's been interesting because, the thing that brought me into the spiritual world, I guess, or into deeper spiritual communities, is that I've always felt like I've had one foot in like activism and one foot in spirituality, and that the two communities didn't necessarily mix. And so I was in a position when I was about 20 where I was in an activist organization where I was seeing people talk about things that they believed in and organizing and being really passionate about their beliefs. But behind closed doors, they were doing like the shittiest things, And I saw a huge disconnect, and I started to really wonder, like, these are the beliefs that I hold, absolutely. Around anti-racism work and decolonization and, like doing really deep healing on a global scale. But I also want to be in a position where I am working with people who are actually showing me that they believe what they're talking about beyond just their external image. And so I was placed in a position where, I was really trying to hold people accountable or get people to hold themselves accountable. And they were asking me to be someone that I wasn't. And I was in a position where I often had to, when you're a person of color, you have to sometimes code switch. You have to become a different person in different spaces in order to survive in these spaces. And so I was sacrificing aspects of my identity in order to show up in a way that was acceptable to like white folks in activist spaces. And as a result of that, I felt like I was losing my sense of self. I was in a predominantly white town. I come from, I was born and raised in Toronto. And it was really hard. I felt like I was losing pieces of who I am and what I stand for and what I believe in. I was being asked to not share my experiences as a woman in male-dominated spaces. I was asked to silence my opinions as a Black person in predominantly white spaces. And when I started having mental health issues, I was asked to perform in a way that didn't acknowledge my experiences as someone surviving with depression. And all of that really compounded to this experience of, I don't know, it was just a catalyst that started bringing up everything in my life. And you know what it was, now that I'm thinking about it, and I know this, it's a lack of control, right? When you experience trauma at that age, and often this is an experience of trauma survivors when, things happen beyond your control, and all of a sudden you're starting to cling for any kind of control you have in your life. And I started feeling like I was losing control in my life at that particular time. one of the things that you have control of in your life is your identity. And I see often that when people are challenged with their identity, it's like the root of who we are. And when we're challenged, when that aspect of ourselves is challenged, it's really hard for us to explore that, right? Because that means that who I am is wrong, and then I have to fundamentally shift who I am. And so I was in a control spiral, I guess. And that that loss of control over myself and the way that I wanted to present myself in spaces really brought up all of the other instances in my life when I had lost control.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it really sounds like there were aspects of yourself that you had to hide in order to be able to survive and participate in that activist space. And yeah, that basically you that was no longer an option because it felt so wrong and it wasn't who you wanted to be.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, what was the initial part of that healing journey then? Like, was it the entry into the spiritual spaces, or was it something else that you reached for at that point in time?
Yeah. So the first thing that I did actually was I locked my hair. So I turned my hair into dreadlocks. And that was an act of resistance for me, because Black people specifically, are not often afforded the opportunity to wear our natural hairstyles. And we're often shamed for doing so. And so at that point in my life, I was straightening my hair a lot. I was wearing extensions and weaves and all of that stuff. And I had decided that I wasn't going to do that anymore, and that I was going to reclaim this aspect of myself. And that is when that started. And, my hair has been in dreadlocks, or locks as we call them. Ever since. And it's been such a beautiful and healing experience. And it's one of those things where every time I look in the mirror, I remember like where my healing journey began, because I can actually, see it.
Yeah.
And remember that that's, sort of like where the conscious healing began and where I am now. And that's how it started.
I love that, because it's like a visual reminder to yourself every time you see it. And I bet also it was almost like a signal to the people around you at that point in time that something is shifting for you.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. Yeah.
So what did you notice, I guess, in terms of the reaction to that, if there was any at that point?
Most people didn't have a problem with it, actually. And you would get little comments like here and there, like, oh, how long are you keeping that in? And it was like forever. But a lot of the reaction came from my mom and my family, because they know that, or from their personal experience, if I was to make a permanent decision like this, that equaled loss of opportunity, loss of job, loss of financial security for me, because this is the world that we live in. So I was often, challenged by my mom, like, are you sure you want to do this? It's not too late to change your mind. Because, your mom fears for you. She wants the best for you, and she wants to make sure that you have the best foot moving forward. But I'm very stubborn, like she is. And so I was like, no, like, this is what I'm doing. And I've never regretted the decision.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can understand why she would be concerned about your safety, your survival, in terms of your opportunities, for making that kind of change. So in terms of the emotional processing then, like, how did that piece play into your healing journey? Like dealing with that immense grief of, losing your dad at such an early age, and having it be a shock because you didn't really understand, what it meant that he was having those kinds of health issues.
hmm for me, one of the biggest journeys has been understanding my emotions, going on a journey of actively understanding, well, what does it mean when my anger is activating, when it's flaring up? Or what does it mean when I'm jealous? Or what does it mean when I'm sad and I'm grieving? And decoding the language of my emotions. I often see that as ancestral work as well, because I find that when I'm feeling something, it's because I'm experiencing it personally, but also I see it as a message from the ancestors. So, for example, when I'm feeling jealous, jealousy for me is a message that the person or the thing that I'm jealous about holds something that I deeply desire, and that there's an unhealed wound within me that believes that I can't have what that person has. And so the message that I choose to see from my ancestors is like, heal that thing. Like, you deserve that too. If someone's living a luxurious lifestyle and I want that, then, go and do the thing that you need to do to get that.
Yeah.
Anger for me is about teaching you about your sense of righteousness. It's what you think is right and what you think is wrong. And it teaches us about that because it flares up, it activates when we experience an injustice or when we experience something that we think is wrong. And so, it's often interesting to me when, horrible things are happening in the world, communities are getting attacked, and people are saying, well, anger is not the right way to deal with it. And it's like, well, what is the right way to deal with it? Because anger teaches us about what we think is right and wrong. Anger is actually a really healthy emotion to feel. Um, and so, yeah, so I've been on this journey of really understanding my emotions and working with them as if they are, actual beings there to guide me. And it's been really, really beautiful in that kind of way.
Yeah, because then they're like little messengers that are like, "Hey, look at this. Have you considered this?"
Yeah,
Yeah, which can be more inviting in terms of being able to deal with it and not trying to kind of push it away or shove it down.
absolutely. Hmm.
Yeah. Um, so coming back to like when you had a kid and then, bringing your healing journey to the next level, like how has that influenced like how your own understanding of your emotions and like, how you deal with them?
Yeah. So it's been really beautiful because I understand my emotions at such a great depth, and now I'm able to better explain to not only myself but to my son whenever I'm feeling something. Like, he's very empathic. Like, he feels what I feel. um we'll watch movies together and he will like cry and I'll cry. Like, we're
Oh,
very, it's just, Moana is a favorite right now.
I love
And
that movie.
yeah, we just like bawl all the time. And he'll look at me and his eyes are all swelled up with water, and it's so cute. But it's been really nice to be able to explain, like, in moments when, I'm not my best and I'm having a bad day and I'm irritated. um, I can explain to him, like, that mommy's angry today, or mommy's not, mommy needs to take a breath, or mommy needs to, um, you know, meditate for a little bit. And he completely understands, and he'll try to sit with me, or he'll ask what he can do. It's not his job ever to regulate my emotions or help me regulate my emotions, but he's so connected in that way. And I think when you understand yourself, and you have to become very intentional when you're a parent, because they are such a sponge and they soak up everything. And I'm very aware of the fact that whenever I'm experiencing an emotion, I have the tools to self-regulate, and then I have the tools to show him how he too can self-regulate. And I think that's so important, because I mean, self-regulation is such a big part of being a well and fully functioning human being, one that is accountable for their own actions and for their own, um, the way that they are in the world. And so, you know, when I take responsibility and I am accountable for myself and for how I am responding to situations, he's responding to that as well. And so, really connecting with my emotions has been a really beautiful experience for the both of us. And I've also, it opens up dialogue about, his own experience with his emotions. So I'll often ask him, when's the last time you got angry, or were you angry today, and what made you angry? And we can really dissect, the things that make him angry, because that's really where it starts. You have to be aware of your emotions and what you're feeling, because when you are, then you can have conversations about them. So if I'm angry, I can explain why I'm angry and what we can do to mitigate the situation so that it doesn't happen again. You know what I mean? So these are all tools that he can now take and problem solve at the small, tender age of 3 with his own friends at daycare. So I'm, super proud.
Yeah, that's just amazing. Because it sounds like what you're really doing is infusing a new level of emotional awareness within him, and at such a young age too.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to have those conversations about, what you're feeling, why it's happening, what you guys can do about it, both for yourself as well as for him.
Absolutely. One of the things that, as an overarching umbrella of healing that I'm doing right now, is I'm healing the impacts of colonization within my family. And one of the tools or the side effects of colonization and systems of harm is disconnection. It disconnects us from ourselves. It disconnects us from our truth. It disconnects us from each other. It disconnects us from our cultures, our customs, our traditions. And it disconnects us from our emotions, right? And so anywhere where we can reconnect to things that we once upon a time didn't have access to resources to, I try to do that. So reconnecting to your emotions and being able to have the language to describe them has been so important in my own healing journey. And, I never want my son to feel like he can't express himself, because that's one of the most frustrating things, when you're feeling things, but you don't know what you're feeling or why you're feeling them. And so I'm really passionate about emotional wellness in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, because that connection is so important, to be able to connect to what you're experiencing and to be able to process it in order to move through it, as opposed to just letting it stay there and kind of become another layer of trauma.
For sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm curious about, what are your favorite tools to self-regulate? What are some of the things that you do or use to help with that?
Mm-hmm. I breathe a lot.
Breathing's amazing.
Yeah. Consciously, I breathe. I meditate all day long. Honestly, and when I say meditate, what I mean is, I have a constant practice of coming back to my breath. Whether I'm washing dishes or I'm doing laundry or I'm working, I have a tendency of holding my breath. And so when I'm not breathing, I come back to, just doing 1 minute of breathing. And I try to stay conscious with it as much as possible throughout my day. That's been one of the most transformative techniques for me for self-regulation. Talking has been a really beautiful experience for me. Again, I tend to hold things a lot. So being able to verbalize what I'm feeling, when I'm feeling, why I'm feeling, has been so helpful in being able to regulate. I think sometimes we hold some shame or perhaps guilt about our emotions. And for me anyway, shame has been one of the things of, one of the reasons why it's been so difficult for me to verbalize my feelings, or fear as well, like a fear that if I share what I'm actually feeling, that I then become unlovable, or I'm not as cool as people thought I was, or whatever other fears come up. But I've worked really hard on that, and so there's nothing more freeing than being able to verbalize what I'm feeling. and to share that with others. And, you know, what the really cool thing is, when you start doing these things, you give permission for other people to do that as
Totally.
well. So it's been really beautiful to see people say, you know, get taken aback a little bit when you share certain things, because, you know, people aren't used to hearing certain things, and then they sit with it and they think about it, and then it gives them permission to do the same, you know, and I think that's beautiful. Boundaries has been really helpful as a tool for self-regulation. So boundaries can mean, you know, I just need a minute to collect myself. Or it means, you know, putting up a firmer boundary of like, I'll get back to you when I get back to you, you know?
Yeah.
And that has been really helpful. For me, a lot of self-regulation is about like being accountable for not causing more harm. Just because I have been activated or triggered in a particular way doesn't mean that I have the right to then respond in a way that will trigger another person. Sometimes that happens because that's the trauma response. But again, the more conscious you become, the more aware you become of your behaviors and your reactions, the easier it becomes for you to just take a moment so that you're not creating more harm in the world. And so that's been really helpful for me, setting boundaries, and being very vocal. I think those are the three that have been the most useful for me. And, you know, constantly studying. I often say, like, there are 3 blocks to liberation. There's ignorance, there's fear, and then there's depletion, you know? And so when you can substitute ignorance for awareness, you're breaking through one of those blocks. When you can substitute courage for fear, you're breaking through one of those blocks. And when you can, you know, depletion is really about like not having enough time or energy or resources to do the thing that you want to do. And so when you're on this healing journey of being accountable to yourself and to other people, it really becomes, you know, finding the time, finding the energy, finding the resources, and also making resources available if you're in positions of power to do so, with other people. So yeah, those are some of the main ways that I regulate.
Yeah, I love those. And I particularly loved you defining boundaries, or including this as part of boundaries, like the whole I need a minute thing, because I've never really thought about that as a boundary, but it is. It's kind of like, give me some space right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can see
Yeah,
that
like
totally.
I don't have to respond right now. So many people expect, especially like when you're in a heated conversation or just for anything, you know, or this idea that like someone texts us and we have to text right back. Like that is not, you know, it's whether technology has been amazing, but it's also really infringed on our ability to set boundaries for ourselves, and for people to accept other people's boundaries. And so I think, you know, thinking as things evolve, thinking about new ways of setting boundaries and reminding ourselves what boundaries really are, I think is really important.
Totally. Yeah. Because the expectation right now with, you know, everything being digitally communicated and text and whatever, it is instantaneous. It's like, if you don't respond right away, there's some kind of problem. Or at least that's how some people perceive that, you know? And
Absolutely.
So it's important to have clear expectations about, you know, what you're willing to do in terms of like time frames for responses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, I'm just going to recap. So the breath and talking and boundaries are key parts of the tools to self-regulate. And one thing that came to mind actually when you were talking about the sharing piece and sharing, you know, feelings, even though there may be some shame or guilt around it, is it's almost like an invitation for others to be vulnerable too. I think that's how it creates that safe space for others to share their process or their experience, as opposed to maybe having that same fear or guilt or shame around what they're feeling.
For sure. You know, one of the things I'm constantly thinking about is like, what am I normalizing? You know, every action that I take, as much as I can, like in terms of being really conscious about what I'm doing, I'm constantly thinking like, what am I normalizing? Often it's in relation to my son, because, you know, that's the most the biggest relationship in my life right now, the one that's requiring the most time. So I'm thinking about like, what am I normalizing for him? But what are you normalizing in your friendships? What are you normalizing in your family? What are you normalizing, in just your connection to social media and the way that you show up there? It's all about, what are we normalizing? And I think when we start normalizing things like vulnerability, and talking about things that we feel ashamed about, and honesty and authenticity, and connection, and, humanness, right? There's such a standard to be perfect in so many ways that we forget that we're not robots. We're actually human beings, and all of our flaws are perfectly okay, and make us actually really interesting human beings. I think then the world becomes a lot more easier to live in, and it becomes a lot more compassionate and enjoyable.
Yeah. And I would add safer for everyone too.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. So many of us, it's a privilege to be able to be vulnerable. It's a privilege to talk about our shame. We don't, because when we are vulnerable and we talk about the things that matter to us and the things that we're feeling and experiencing, and that can end in removing, or the end of relationships. It can end in, it could threaten our safety, like in terms of being in an abusive relationship, maybe. It can remove financial security or take away opportunities for us. There are so many things that get removed from us when we are when we are vulnerable. So we have to be conscious about that. It's not something, I say it kind of lightly, but it's not actually a light thing. It's, people only deserve your vulnerability when they can be trusted. And I think for those of us who feel a little bit easier being vulnerable, we have a responsibility to make other people feel safe to be vulnerable as well.
Totally. Yeah, I totally get that. And on that note, so I know that you help other people do healing, like you help other people with healing their own trauma, both individually and collectively. So what does that look like?
Yeah, so I do coaching sessions, for folks who want to work on themselves, who want to heal, ancestral wounds, who want to, right the wrongs of their ancestors. And I also am launching, the Aquarian Woman Liberation Network. So this is it's a private online community for women who are socially and spiritually conscious and who are really invested in practicing liberation, and practicing it at the intersection of spirituality and social justice. So that means understanding that these two spaces are not separate. They're super connected, and understanding that the way that we are within our spiritual practice is the way that we are outside. So really this community is for women who want to practice what they practice in private, what they preach in public. It's for women who are interested in being allies. This is cis and trans women, of course. And this is about people who are really invested in just making the world a better place, not just on a superficial level, but on a day-to-day level of making your allyship and your activism, a sadhana, a daily spiritual practice, because that's what it's going to take. We have to wake up every day. We have to show up, and we have to be able to use the power that we do have, even if we think we don't have very much. We all have different levels of power and privilege, and being able to use what we have right now to create spaces of equity for other people. And so this is a community about grounding yourself in ancestral wisdom. It's a community about understanding that in order to move forward, we have to understand where we come from. We have to understand how our families have benefited from the oppression of other people, which isn't an easy thing to do. and understanding that our privilege always comes at the expense of others, so we have hard conversations, but we have hard conversations with compassion. And it's really focusing on doing the things in private that we talk about in public.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like a safe space for growth and integrity, and also coming into alignment with a higher version of yourself.
Absolutely. Integrity is so important. At the end of the day, it's about who are you becoming? Who do you want to be? And how willing are you to show up every day being that person that you say you want to be? Often we have a disconnect between our values and what we say our values are and what our values actually are. And so, my thing about values is that our values are where we actually spend our time, our energy, and our resources. And so we can say, I value acceptance and love for all and, access to resources for all. And distributing wealth for all. But at the end of the day, where are we actually putting our time, energy, and resources? Because that is very telling in terms of like what we're actually valuing. And so again, like I can say I value, parenting consciously, but if I'm actually not putting the work in to parent consciously, then I'm not actually valuing that. I'm just saying I am. So, I love Brene Brown's definition of integrity. Of course, I'm going to forget it now, but it's, choosing courage over comfort, choosing to do what's right instead of what's fun, fast, or easy, and choosing to practice your values instead of professing them. That is one of my favorite quotes because she just nails it so effortlessly. It's like, that's absolutely what integrity is. And when we live life from that place, we feel better about ourselves 100%,
Totally. Yeah. Because I think that actually goes back to what you were talking about earlier when you were in that activism group when in your 20s, when people were saying things, but then not necessarily acting in that way. And then also almost trying to push you out of alignment for yourself.
Totally. And I do want to say as well that I also experienced the same on the other side. So, for me, it was like I started out with activism and then I went into spirit communities and then I saw, everyone was really focused on doing inner work and not putting that work outside of the yoga spaces or outside of the spiritual communities. It's like there's always a disconnect, with the activism spaces that I was in. I saw that there was a disconnect. We wanted to focus so much on other people and the ways that other people are creating harm and not look at the way that we are doing that. And, in spirit communities, we're looking at how we can be better people, but not understanding that ultimately transforms or translates into how we are in the world. And so, it's been very interesting kind of navigating these two communities. I think we're getting better at merging that. In the last decade or so, I've seen a lot of change, but it's been hard being a member of both communities because, there's resistance. There's huge resistance. It's like activist groups are like, I'm not about the woo woo. And then the spiritual groups are like, I'm not about the politics. And there's no place there's no place in spirit communities for politics, and for, talking about lived experiences and talking about race and sexuality and gender and all of those things. And we know that that's just not true. So,
right. Yeah. Because you can't kind of erase that part of your human experience. It's all integrated. And so it really is about integrating everything and, bringing the wisdom from the spiritual space into the world and showing up in the world in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's such rich teachings on both sides and everyone can learn from each other in that way. And I think as people in spiritual communities, we've developed a level of resilience and a level of understanding and a level of compassion that we can then extend out into the world in a really beautiful, honest, and aligned way. But we just have to have that courage to speak truth to power, and shift people's minds.
Yeah. Yeah. It really, courage is such a critical part of it. to be able to speak up, share what you're really thinking or feeling, and be a part of that change, be part of that driving force to create a new world for everyone to be in.
For sure.
Yeah. So I know we already touched on this, but where can people find you and how can they work with you?
Yeah, so they can find me on my website, demetriajackson.com, and also on Instagram at Demetria Jackson.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Demetria. It's been a delight to have this conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you all for listening. Until next time, may you be guided by your light.